very much for that introduction, and thank you for yourselves for inviting me to do this talk. So this talk kind of came about from, I suppose, me going through a little bit of a mid-career crisis, maybe. I don't know if crisis is a too strong a word, but I've been involved in doing lots of different stuff in relation to cyber psychology. For those of you who might not be familiar with cyber psychology, by the way, I'm going to give a quick definition in a moment, so don't panic. And I thought at the point I was kind of reflecting on all the kind of things that were in my mind at the time and how was all this kind of coming together. And I thought, well, as I'm going through this kind of reflection process, it sort of makes sense to be able to impart what I learned from doing this upon other people. So this is sort of where this talk comes from, and thought it was always quite nice to sort of situate it in a sort of 10 lessons thing. So you've got a nice sort of structure to it. So that's basically where this talk comes from. So thanks for joining and helping me share these insights. The introduction gave a bit of information about the kind of stuff I've been involved in, and I am an academic. My bread and butter of the work I do is based in teaching and research in cyber psychology, and most of the insights I'll be sharing today are from that kind of work. You know, working in applying cyber psychology broader has been really useful in bringing a lot of these insights together as well. So I've done quite a lot of media engagement stuff over the last few years, which really helps understand what the kind of public facing issues might be. So journalists asking questions which are of interest to society more generally, and that gives a really prominent focus for what are the key questions that in cyber psychology we should be asking that society need answering. Also working in leading the BPS cyber psychology section is useful in thinking about what things like policy and regulation of cyber psychology comes in, accreditation of cyber psychology courses and the more regulatory kind of issues. And of course the kind of consultancy stuff I do is working with stakeholders, so particular organisations who are looking to understand things about their users and technological solutions around what might be effective on things like app development and all that kind of stuff. So I've been really fortunate to be able to apply cyber psychology in many different ways with lots of different hats on. So this sort of talk is trying to meld some of those issues together to look at cross-cutting sort of themes, I guess. So just in case anybody who isn't aware of what cyber psychology is, and I will be talking obviously a lot about this, so essentially it's just a subfield of psychology, and psychology actually as a subject is of course very broad, but cyber psychology essentially is a sub-discipline of this and looks at what the psychological experiences and impacts are when we're engaging in new technology or aspects of the internet. So of course it's really current in terms of our everyday experiences, even more so now probably in pandemic times when we are making excessive use of technology to enable us to do everyday activities more so perhaps than normal. So really current in terms of an area of advancement, both societally and academically. So starting off with the first lesson. So generally, because cyber psychology is actually still very much emerging as a discipline, there's actually quite a lot of work needed in terms of conceptualizing things and the kind of key theories that are important for us to understand. And one of these, of course, is a term you may be very familiar with that you see a lot in media debate and newspapers and so on, is this idea of screen time. And this is thrown around a lot, and there's tons of research that's looked at it, but generally it's problematic because it's really badly conceptualized. So, I mean, when we start to think about what screen time is, then we can go to the kind of everyday definitions. So the Oxford English Dictionary, for example, gives a definition of what screen time is. It mentions certain devices such as computers, etc. Doesn't actually mention smartphones, which is interesting, given that that's probably the device we use most in terms of time spent using it. We then have the World Health Organization, and they talk about screen time but make distinctions between levels of activity, physical activity in using it, which of course as a health organization is prominent to the things they're focused on. Either way, irrespective of what these sort of lay person definitions are, they're just very vague and not very useful, and kind of just assume that any time using a screen is this kind of homogeneous and unidimensional activity. And from a psychological perspective, that's not really very interesting at all. You know, we're much more interested in knowing what people are doing on there, how they're interacting, and therefore why psychologically that's going to be important and relevant. Just looking at time per se is just not a very interesting or, in my view, a very relevant question to be looking at. So when we think, OK, well, let's have a look at the academic research on there. There's a bad conceptualization in lay terms, but maybe academic insight can actually clarify some of these issues a bit. Unfortunately, that's not the case. When you actually look at the academic research on this sort of so-called screen time concept, actually the terminology used is very interchangeable. I've been recently doing some meta-analysis in this sort of area, and these are just some examples of the different terms that different authors use when referring to things that vaguely refer to something to do with screen time. So it's a little bit questionable whether these actually are referring to the same thing, what kind of activities are being incorporated in these, and generally doesn't give us an awful lot of clarity on what we're referring to. Now, why is this a problem? Well, it's a problem in the first place from a conceptual point of view. But of course, if you can't theorise something, you can't conceptualise something, how on earth are you actually going to measure it? Which brings me on to the second issue. However, before I actually sort of go through in a bit more detail on that, I just have a quick thinking activity for everybody to do. And you don't need to necessarily share this with anybody or write comments in, but just have a few moments to have a think about answering these questions. So if I was to ask you the question, how many hours TV did you watch last weekend? I want you to try and come up with a number. Think about whether you are an active social media user, yes or no, or maybe you're not sure. And then the final question, on average, how many hours per week do you spend on the internet? So I'd just like you to take just a few moments to have a bit of a think about how you would answer these if I was to ask you these questions. OK, so you may not have thought through all of them, but maybe the thing that you're experiencing is that you might be unclear on how to answer that question, or you might be finding it difficult to come up with a number, a numerical answer for some of these. And if that's the case, then you are not alone. I've done this sort of activity numerous times in many different contexts with my own students at different conferences and so on. And usually the types of things that come back include things like what the reference point is that's being used and how people should answer. So for example, on the first question, the reference point for what TV refers to is actually quite debatable. So some of you might have been thinking, well, this is when I sit down in front of my big TV thing in my front room and watch TV. That's the reference point some of you may be using. Others of you may have been using a reference point about watching TV that's been broadcast, but you might be watching on catch up, for example, through another device. So it's still a TV broadcast, but being watched through a different device, which isn't actually a TV set. So people's understanding of and reference point for what TV refers to can actually be quite different, which obviously is going to then affect how you answer that question. Last weekend, when does that start? Does that start on a Friday evening? Does that start on a Saturday morning? When does it end? Is it a Monday morning? Is it a Sunday evening? Is it a different day altogether? So again, that's reference point can be ambiguous for people. When asking what are you an active social media user, again, this reference point can mean different things to different people. Some people you might have thought, well, yeah, I've got a Facebook account or an Instagram account, so yeah, that means I'm an active user. Some people might have thought, yeah, I've got Instagram, but I don't really use it much, so actually, no, I'm not an active social media user. So it might relate to frequency of use rather than actual whether you've got an account or not. Other people might be thinking what active means is something about how much you engage with that. So whether you actually take time to create and curate content, or whether you have an account but just look at what other people are doing. So active can mean lots of different things to different people. So again, your answer to this would depend on how you are understanding, interpreting that particular word. And then finally, I think the last question is pretty impossible to answer because we spend so much time on the internet in general terms, and you know it's quite difficult making distinctions across an average week that might be different for different days, and trying to kind of average that out can be really difficult.
I يعني ولك حقك.
Let's just make sure you're muted, please. Thanks, Brill. Okay, so this is problematic, and the reason is that these types of questions might be the ones that researchers are using when they're measuring things to do with screen time. So it's not uncommon that these kind of questions might be included, for example, in online surveys that cyber psychologists might be using to measure these things. And if these are the kind of questions that are ambiguous, and people aren't able to ask questions to researchers, then the types of data we're getting from these studies are potentially very problematic. So that brings us to the second issue about measurement and the general perception that people are generally really bad at estimating their screen time. It's really ironic because actually cyber psychology researchers are interested in broad terms about technology use, but in general don't actually make really very good use of technology data to actually study it, which is really ironic. There are actually some really cool studies that have been coming out over the last few years which really illuminate this issue about measurement. And I've been finding that when you kind of compare people's estimates of their use, so you ask them, for example, how much they tend to use smartphones per day or how many times do they access smartphones per day, people tend to be really bad at estimating when you compare that to actual log data from smartphones or screen time apps and so on. So when you're comparing these objective and subjective types of measurement, you tend to find a lot of differences and some discrepancies. And this has been now found across quite a lot of different studies, suggesting that asking people about their screen time, such as the kind of questions which I was asking before, is actually really not going to be very good science, and we're not getting very accurate data. And there's actually been a study recently that looked at how the relationship between things like smartphone use and mental health outcomes is actually very different if you look at objective use compared to more subjective use. So the effect is more overinflated if you're relying on sort of subjective reports. So actually the things we think we know about screen time possibly are actually being quite skewed and potentially incorrect based on the measurement issues. So that's you know, an ongoing issue in this area. Which brings us to the next issue. So within cyber psychology, it's actually really common for a lot of kind of categorization to be evident. So we talk about things like online identity or online behavior, and we kind of put this preposition of online or offline in front of the thing we're interested in. But this is actually really problematic when you think about something like online identity or online behavior. First of all, it assumes that the online and offline are kind of exclusive from each other, that they don't interact, which isn't the case. And the other issue is that it assumes that an online identity, for example, is consistent across all different types of online spaces, which again isn't the case. So when you think about the first issue, obviously our online and offline experiences do very much interrelate and intertwine with each other. And in many ways, our online experiences are very much just a kind of extension, or in some cases, a subtraction from ourselves. So it's better not to think about them as being exclusive categories, but an extension or part of ourselves as a more general kind of category. And you know, this issue about Internet of Things, you know, this idea that we're connected in terms of our devices, and you know, things like smartwatches or smart alarm bells and doorbells, sorry, and washing machines and all these things. You know, it's very much the case that, you know, our interactions with our real world behaviours and our and so on is very much intertwined with our online data and experiences. So it's really difficult to tease those apart. And of course, if we're taking this idea of online identity and assuming we have just one online identity, that's clearly problematic. And we don't just own one identity online. We have many different online spaces that we occupy, and they're very diverse ways we represent ourselves. So again, you know, having those kind of categorizations is quite problematic. So that's that issue. And the next issue is about generally sort of an observation about sort of thinking forward in this sort of area. And there's some interesting sort of observations about language that we use when talking about things like online experiences or using technology. And we tend to use the term user when we're referring to our use of technology or the internet. your Facebook user or whatever. And there's something interesting there, because it's kind of, we're situating ourselves almost a little bit away from the technology, and we use prepositions like on rather than in, which I think is a really interesting observation, because I think it says something about the fact that we're not really fully embodying ourselves in our experiences online. We're sort of looking at ourselves as being next to it maybe, but we're not, rather than in it. So I think that's going to start to become actually quite problematic when we, because we are integrating ourselves so much more in online spaces, becoming so important as part of everyday human interaction and everyday functioning. Citizenship is actually really important to understand here, to situate ourselves more fully in these experiences. And then there's these, it might be something you're familiar with, this idea of digital immigrants versus digital natives. Again, these terms haven't got an awful lot of academic support when you look at the actual evidence on these. So digital immigrants are said to be people who grew up without the internet. Now, it's only going to be a number of years before that's never going to be the case. Everybody will have grown up alongside the internet being invented. So, how much more leg room has digital immigrants got in this debate? Probably not very long left. So it seems like it's going to kind of not be relevant in a few years. So, there's generally thinking forward on these issues. I think there's a kind of lack of foresight of how these are going to be relevant in the future. Next issue. I've always worked in an area that is very polarized. So my area of research primarily is the psychology of digital gaming, but I do look at online behaviours more generally, and that's riddled with a lot of kind of pro and anti kind of perspectives, which can be useful, because actually that's how debate and discussion and advancement can happen in science. But at the same time, what happens is you get too much polarization. And the problem when you look at anything to do with technology is that you have quite polarized perspectives. People's either epistemological or philosophical perspectives about these issues kind of drive people's positions on these sorts of debates. So very much motivated kind of by these positions. And therefore that kind of drives how the agenda that people are trying to support when they're doing their research or are discussing things publicly about technology, which can be really difficult to then tease out. And it means that there's no real middle ground between these different kind of opposing perspectives, which makes that kind of debate really difficult. So it's always been common to the work I do that there's this kind of polarization, which is really, really difficult to then navigate, and to recognise that essentially you're all looking at the same phenomena, but just maybe from a slightly different perspective. And there's work to be done in trying to amalgamate some of those viewpoints, because then we can understand the phenomena. But yeah, I think these positions are a really strong driver for a lot of the stuff we hear about technology, which is a bit unfortunate really when it doesn't help progress the science. Okay, going back to kind of concept stuff. So one of the problems with cyber psychology is because it's quite emerging, there's often a lack of kind of theoretical basis of a lot of this sort of stuff. So I suppose broadly, the psychologists are interested in technology use. However, technology use means a lot of things. It's a complex process, and that can refer to anything to do with why people might use technology in the first place, what feeds into whether they start adopting it and using it, how different behaviours and interactions happen when they're actually using it, and why they might continue to use it. What are their experiences around engagement and use? Now, these are all different parts of actually the same process. However, what the problem is when you actually look at the research, the academic research on this and technology use as a process, you actually have to look at very different areas of research, different literatures, to actually be able to understand the phenomena as a whole. So when you start to want to understand things like why do people use technology in the first place, you can draw on things like users and gratifications theory. Why does using this help gratify some kind of need, for example? You then might want to look at why people start using a technology or software in the first place, and then that's where you go down the technology acceptance literature. And there's tons of research on that. But again, that's situated a little bit further away from cyber psychology, but actually is still relevant. And then all these other kind of literatures, which are really quite disparate from each other, but ultimately are still helping understand the same phenomena. So it's actually really difficult to navigate, you know, as a student or an academic in this area, having to kind of be almost have your finger in lots of different pies to be able to understand the same one phenomena. So yeah, it becomes quite difficult to integrate all these things together. Next issue. So obviously something that cyber psychologists are interested in, things like social media. This is obviously a very popular everyday activity which a lot of people engage with. However, I don't think we've really fully actually answered the question about how social media actually is, despite the fact it's called social media. I think the most we've kind of got to is to establish that there might be different patterns of use. So I mentioned this briefly earlier. So people might be more active, for example, on social media. So might actually create content or interact with other people's content or talk to people online on social media, whereas other people might be more have an account but just sort of use it to be updated on what other people are doing. There's sort of more recent theory on this, which is really useful, that kind of distinguishes this a little bit more, and actually talks about 3 different levels of types of patterns of use. One being more interactive, so when you're actually having a bi-directional conversation, for example, with another person or other people. More reactive, so you might be commenting or liking other people's content, for example, but there's not necessarily a bi-directional flow of communication. And then the final, more passive, so that kind of more observing and not necessarily directly interacting with other people, which is quite helpful, I think. So May and Raynock, actually, to kind of take this a little bit further, I keep coming back to this because it's actually really useful theory to kind of understand interactions with social media, is that they identify various levels of how we interact online. And the bottom 4 levels there are very much focused on the device or the channel itself. So very much about at the first level, what is the device you're actually interacting with? Is it a laptop or a phone or what? And then you move up to kind of types of applications. So is it a social media app or a website or whatever? And then you get up to another level of specific branded apps. So whether it's Facebook or Instagram or whatever. And then at the final level of the channel communication is what the specific features of that app might be. So is it a direct message? Is it a comment, etc., etc. But the thing I suppose psychologists are more interested in is actually the top level. This is the kind of communication centered aspect, where you're actually more interested in who are the people are interacting with. Are they close friends? Are they acquaintances? Are they work colleagues? You know, how many people might be in that group, for example. And then finally, what's the actual modalities and the actual, you know, intricacies of that social interaction. So, you know, this really is useful because it helps us understand what we mean when we talk about online interactions, and it refers to things more than just interacting with people, but the actual devices and the functionalities themselves as well on another level. So it's really helpful to try and help us answer this question about how social media is. And those top two things, can't find the word, levels, are the things that are going to help us answer that question a little bit more. I'm actually doing some research at the moment. One of my collaborators is Dr. Charlotte Pennington, who I know used to work at UWE, and we actually have taken these kind of 3 levels that Mayer and Reinhardt talked about, and actually we developed a social media task to actually try and quantify these different types of behaviours that people might be doing. So we have a behavioural task that we can use in research to try and then establish, do we see qualitative differences based on different patterns of use and how that then might correspond to psychologically interesting things. So we've recently got some data where we want to look, do we see that there's a difference in people's level of things like loneliness or social connection, for example, if people are more active, so more interactive, for example, rather than passive. We actually originally designed this social media task to actually do some fMRI research, so looking at people's activation of brain and social reward systems through fMRI technology. We were literally just about to start this when the first lockdown hit, so it would have been this time last year. So we did some online pilot data instead to look at some different things. But yeah, there's something interesting here about having a behavioural task where we can quantify these different types of behaviours to see how that might correspond to different issues like, you know, social connection and loneliness and all this kind of stuff, which is obviously a very prominent issue that we look at in this area. And that moves on to the sort of next issue, which is in terms of this idea of social media and well-being. And this obviously is a really big societal issue, which, you know, a lot of people are talking about. The media likes to talk about this a lot. And we get, you know, headlines, or in this case, conversation pieces with titles such as this, which in my view is really problematic. My cyber psychology students this year, for example, actually used this conversation piece as a stimulus to critically evaluate this claim, and in many cases did a really good job of debunking it actually, when you actually look at the evidence on this and what we mean by things like social media, because that's very broad in itself. So one of the best ways really to start tackling this is stop talking about social media use, because that's just way too broad, but instead start to look at what I'm sort of kind of a framework I've been starting to use a bit more, is this idea of the what, the how and the why. So what are people interacting with? Because clearly, depending what you're interacting with on social media is going to have some impact in some way on things like well-being. You know, if you look at harmful content, for example, that's not going to be as favourable as if you're looking at nice content. A lot of the research in this area focuses on things like image-based content, like things like Instagram or TikTok, where, you know, the research looks at how that corresponds to things like body image and self-esteem. But that's only one area of social media use. That doesn't kind of cover all types of social media use. So those effects are kind of, you know, more isolated to those kinds. It doesn't tell us much about other kinds of social media use. We can also answer the question about how. So this goes back to what I was saying before about the levels of interactivity that we have with other people. You know, when you're interacting more actively and interactively with people, that's probably going to be better for well-being than if you're just sort of observing what other people are doing. You're less socially involved. So that's the kind of question we've been asking on what I was talking about before. And then finally, why people are using social media. Some people make really good use of social media as a proactive way of seeking social support or to be part of communities, whereas other people, it might just be kind of a way of passing time, or, you know, doing something to avoid, you know, as a part of a procrastination thing. And again, that's not going to be as healthy. So, you know, answering these kind of questions is going to be much more useful to help us understand how social media use, based on these, you know, different perspectives, might relate to well-being. So that's something I've been writing quite a lot about recently, and might help advance this issue a little bit. Okay, a general observation in this area is about young people, and this is really important because most of the societal concern about technology use is in relation to children and young people. And most of the policy priorities, of course, are to do with regulating and protecting children and young people, which obviously is really important. However, when we look at the academic research in this, a lot of the time, young people's voices are actually very much absent. A lot of research is done on adults, for example, or even, you know, adolescents, or older adolescents, sorry. And this is a bit of a shame because it's actually missing the priority group, which, you know, where the most concern is. Somebody who's actually notably an exception on this is the work of Professor Sonia Livingston. She does some really excellent work actually in, you know, including young people's voices in the research. So I do want to note that she is very much an exception to this observation. And recently I actually saw a fellowship, PhD fellowship advert, and this actually made, I've just included this because I was really glad to see this actually was specifically advertising that the research would be making use of participatory methodologies, you know, that involved young people in this, which was really nice to see. So maybe progress is being made on this, but still there's a lot more to be done on there. And then the final issue, which is more from the work I've been doing a lot with the media engagement stuff rather than a kind of academic insight, is it's really great to see actually cyber psychology is becoming increasingly familiar and recognised. So, you know, a lot of the work we're doing on the BPS committee for cyber psychology is working with industry in finding things like where could the work they're doing benefit from cyber psychology, what are the needs that they could use in terms of what the insights for cyber psychology could be. But then on the flip side is actually understanding from courses in cyber psychology and students who might study areas of cyber psychology, what are the kind of ambitions around careers, for example, where we can better support the kind of provision of cyber psychology to ensure that those are kind of future proof, I guess, for careers. So we're trying to join up the dots a little bit with a lot of the committee work we're doing. And part of that is getting the word out to industries about what cyber psychology is, because a lot of times people aren't aware of it. So it does seem that it is becoming more visible. And certainly from my work with working with the media, it does, I'm getting the perception that it's becoming more familiar. Journalists getting in touch because they've heard of this thing, cyber psychology, and want to know more about it. Are contacting cyber psychology researchers because they want to know more about it and the issues in this area. So it's really great to know. So, has a really important role in my view, although I'm very biased. It has a really important role in society, but also policy. So the more visibility we can do on this, the better. And I suppose that's kind of part of the reason why I do this sort of series of talks as well, to kind of just illuminate it for people who may have been less familiar with it before. Okay, so that's the last lesson. But I always like to use this opportunity to do a very, very shameless plug. So I actually have my first book coming out next January, January 2022. I'd really like to open up the opportunity for people who may want the opportunity to win a free copy of it. I will get lots of free copies from the publisher. I'd be really interested to hear what your thoughts are on the following question. So if you want to be in the chance to win a free copy, you can enter a competition. I'll put the link to the competition in a minute when I've finished wittering on. And all you need to do to enter the competition of potentially winning a free copy of my book is to answer the question, what do you think is the most important contribution cyber psychology is making or can make to society? And I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on that if you would like to enter that. Alternatively, if you maybe are interested in doing a review of the book for an outlet somewhere, or if you've got or if there's an event that might be coming up where you think it might be useful to advertise my book, I'd really like to hear from you, just to give some airspace to it. That would be great. Okay, that brings me to the end. I am always very open to receiving questions from people. Obviously, I'm very happy to answer questions now, get through as many as there are. But as was said before, I am very active on Twitter, so you can definitely see a lot of me on there. But yes, that's me. I'm going to stop talking now. Thank you for listening.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Linda. Oh, I'm getting a bit of feedback there. Thank you very much, Linda. That was a fantastic talk, really interesting. If anyone has questions, please do use the chat, or please raise your hand and turn your mic on. It would be great to get some questions now. Just while we're waiting for some questions to come in, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how the pandemic's changed everything, because everyone was saying before, screen time is bad and this, that and the other. And yet we've now spent a year in front of our screens, and it is so embedded in our lives. So you kind of think, well, you can't keep playing the screen time is bad when this is the way we have to operate. So I'd be interested on that one. And I think the points around online and offline behaviours are so important, because there is no distinction between the two. When you ask a question of how long do I spend on the internet, well, my phone is on the internet 24/7 because it's connected. Exactly. So being able to differentiate those kind of things, I think, again, really important.
Yes, no, it's a really good question. It's and I think this is why it's been problematic. People constantly being very anti sort of screens and going, oh yeah, it's really bad for your health being on screens all the time. And it's now sort of got to the point where, oh, we are on screens all the time, and now it's panicked people. So it's been really unhelpful for that. What I've got to say is actually would have been probably April time, I suppose, last year, what I really started to see was a lot of shift in a lot of the media discussion about screens, and suddenly it became really positive. And suddenly it was, oh, online gaming's great to stay connected when you can't physically see people, or oh, it's great you can use these technologies to keep in touch with your friends. And it was like, this is what we've been saying forever. And so it's actually really refreshing to see that the media were really starting to grapple on to what are the positives of this. So that was nice, finally, to be able to, you know, see that. Whether that kind of reverts back is another issue. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's always about understanding what are the particular needs that these screens are affording us, and clearly that's multidimensional. So for me, it's not necessarily understanding how much, it's more understanding what function are they serving. And that's where I think you can start to pinpoint what's healthy and what's not, what's you know, something we can regulate better, what's the things that are actually fine in terms of how much time we spend. I think the problem is a lot of this, it's in relation to technology use generally, is that there's such a predominant focus on time as a metric, and I don't know why are we so obsessed with time? You know, eating, we don't, how much time you spend eating isn't something we focus on, it's what you're eating. You know, in terms of diet, you know, you don't focus on, oh well, how many hours did you spend eating yesterday? We never ask that question. So it would always be, oh, how healthy is your diet, what's the proportionality of healthy and unhealthy food? So the same question is relevant to screens, isn't it? And for me, I think the only way we can really advance understanding is to completely disband the screen time thing, because that's completely unhelpful. And then look at what are the different interactions we have, what are the functions and functionalities of use, and are they functional for us, for work, for study, for socializing, or are they just passing time? So trying to distinguish those is, for me, is the most relevant thing, and then helps that answer that question better about, you know, pandemic related things. So yeah.
Excellent. We've got a question from Ben. He says, how different is the behavioural change in society versus other technological changes, i.e. the introduction of TV or radio?
That's a really good question. I mean, in terms of like societal perceptions, I think it's similar kind of worries and concerns. You see that cycle coming through any new technology that's developed. In terms of the actual behavioural change, I think this is where things like social media are actually a little bit more unique, because unlike things like television or radio, which are very unique, not unidimensional, that's not a word I'm after, it's you're kind of more of a passive observer. You don't actually interact necessarily with those forms of media. With social media, it's obviously a multi-dimensional platform where you've got personalized content, you're actually actively engaging in something. You're not just consuming, you are part of, what's the word I'm looking for? I know what I want to say, I'm just not articulating it very well. I suppose you've got all the various components of, you know, the ethical questions around, you know, adverts and social fake news and all this kind of stuff, and that is a slightly different issue, I think, from TV and radio, because you're an active agent in that experience, whereas, you know, other types of broadcasting, you're a bit more passive, you're receiving it rather than actively consuming it in that way. So I think the kind of behavioural change, I think the first question is the behavioural change, and I don't know if we know the answer to that yet. But the second one is, I think, could be slightly different based on the agency that you have in those experiences. So I don't have a clear-cut answer, but I think there might be a slight difference.
I'll ask a supplementary question to that. One thing that concerns me is I think that many I would discriminate between different forms of technology use very strongly.
Yeah.
I like Twitter. I've deleted Facebook from my phone because I don't like it.
Yeah.
But I think there's a disinhibiting effect to online behaviour, and I think that's falling into meat-based behaviour, and for want of a better term, is coarsening discourse. And I'm just wondering whether, a bit like smoking, we won't realise quite how negative the consequences of some of this is until it's a bit late and we need to solve a pretty major problem. Because it does seem that society has got more aggressive and coarser.
Yeah, I think that's why I asked the question. Sorry, Ben. I think that's why I asked the question. Because you know, it was when TV was introduced, or before TV, it was, oh, he's always got his head in a book, like a negative connotation. Then TV was introduced, and it was, oh my God, they're sat in front of the screen all day, in front of TV all day.
Yeah.
And the advertisement for all of that, you know, for smoking, for example, doctors saying it was healthy for you and was really helpful to smoke.
Yeah.
And all of those, like, to me, it's kind of, we get really excited every time a new technological advance comes along, and we hark back to the good old days. And it's probably likely that when everyone's got a VR headset on, we're going to be saying, oh, remember Twitter? Remember Facebook? Remember how good that was? It was really healthy. You could get away from it. And it's that whole, we sometimes find ourselves so caught in the moment and forgetting that this is nothing new. Like, historically, these things have all occurred before. And we sometimes tend to forget what that's done behavioural, but, you know, to the behavioural science of people moving through those generations.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And no, I completely agree, Ben, with your point about, you know, these moral panics do raise their ugly head every time. Amy Auburn, who does a lot of work in this area, recently published a paper on this. I can't remember what the specific name of it is. I was writing about it yesterday. It's a cycle of moral panics. Anyway, it's a really good paper on this. But yes, going back to your question, Ian. Yeah, I think there is something about the longevity of this and whether it is something we might see the consequence of later down the line. I mean, you know, there's discussions, you know, we see things like people's, you know, attentional processes, and, you know, somebody asked something about this the other day on Twitter, just saying, oh, is there any good evidence that, you know, using social media is making people, you know, much worse at paying attention to things? And it's like, I don't think we've got good evidence on that yet, but there might be anecdotal things on that. But again, I don't think we, you know, if that is the case, that we're going to see that till later down the line. I think the problem with a lot of this stuff is a lot of this research, there's very little longitudinal research, and maybe part of that's because cyber psychology is still very much emerging, and, you know, these trends are still being, you know, the best scientific practices around this are still being established. But some of it is that maybe the technology or the particular things haven't been around long enough to have, you know, warranted research having been done on it yet. So yeah, so I kind of agree with Ben. Sorry, go on.
With respect to moral panics, we used to have a professor of media studies called Martin Barker, and his PhD work was on penny dreadful novels in the Victorian era.
Right.
He then went on to 1950s horror comics, and then the Sun tried to get him sacked in the 80s for work on video nasties, and very much it was exactly the same cycle every time, and it was, you know, the only thing that changed was the format of the media. And yes. I think that there's a lot of that with internet material, for a better term.
Yeah.
So yeah, Jason asked an interesting question. He says, is there much research into the effects of older generations not taking up things like social media, online shopping, etc., and what disadvantages this brings? So, for instance, his parents are both in their 70s, his mum's quite enthusiastic, loves her iPad, dad has a little interest, has an impact on how they see the world.
Interesting. I don't think there's much, as far as I'm aware. I don't tend to do sort of generational research, but I'm not that aware that there's any much research that looks at that in relation to things like worldview or anything like that. I'm just trying to think now off the top of my head whether I'm aware of anything. I think, you know, I think there's pockets of research that looks at how, you know, older adults' use of things like certain social media and technologies might help them stay connected and all that things. I don't think there's anything that's necessarily compared that though in terms of use versus non-use or generational, you know, differences on that I'm aware of. I might be wrong, but I think it's a really good question though, is about what are you relying on for understanding the world. And obviously so much of our everyday experiences we do rely on, not necessarily rely, but we are dependent in some ways on finding things out, and worldviews come from a lot of the interactions we have with various people. So like Twitter, for example, I was thinking about this the other day, is I've just got, I think I'm very much aware I've got a much better world view because of Twitter, because of the range of, you know, cultures people are from, the range of sectors that are on there and subject areas, and it's really useful to kind of extend and be open-minded about things from there. So yes, so I'm not aware of any specific academic research, but I think it's a really good observation, definitely.
So that actually provokes an interesting question about, you say Twitter gives you a very good diverse view of the world, let's say, and yet you also get a lot of people who say things like, you know, oh, I'm on Twitter, it's an echo chamber, you know, I follow people who are like me, and therefore, you know, when I say I don't like this, everyone agrees with me or what have you. And I mean, I in a similar way, I at least am mindful of this, and I try and follow different people, so that I do follow people I disagree with, just to hear what's being said. And again, I wonder if you've got any thoughts about how, you know, how as users, or I shouldn't use the word users, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
How as people who engage on social media, we should be more mindful about having that open view of all walks, so to speak, rather than, you know, agree with the people I want to agree with.
No, it's a really good point, actually. I think it depends on the social media. So I'm thinking about, you know, Twitter as being a really good one to have those bridging and across network kind of interactions, whereas then there's other types of social media which I want to keep locked down, and I you know, it would just be, you know, the people I know and my things. Interestingly, I actually see, in terms of political issues, I actually see more polarization on Facebook rather than Twitter, which is really interesting. And I don't know if it's because on Twitter I might follow a lot of academics who do tend to be more maybe in line with my own political views, whereas, you know, Facebook, I've got family members who are, you know, I can't really delete family members, but they might have a different persuasion. So that's always a really interesting observation. I have no idea how that's kind of happened. But yes, I think it depends how you're engaging on things like these open, you know, public platforms. And I think a lot of that kind of less echoey chamber things comes from different sub-communities that I'm part of. So I'm part of like a learning, teaching, higher education chat thing, and that brings in all sorts of people in there. So it's not something I've deliberately gone and said I'm going to follow them. It's that we just happen to come together in that kind of, you know, that particular interaction, and then you do see those views. So it takes you a bit out of that echo chamber a little bit. So I think it does depend on the range of people you follow, definitely, and what other kind of community activities are being done on there is how it kind of brings people together, or even just, you know, even following certain hashtags, because again, that will bring various people together. You know, currently, you know, very heated, you know, things happening at the moment. A hashtag could bring in very opposing perspectives under the same kind of theme, if you like, and, you know, looking at that kind of information can give you all sorts of viewpoints. So sometimes I think Twitter can be sometimes an echo chamber, but there are these broader community kind of trends and hashtags and things where you can get those broader views, I think. So yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes onto the point of you said earlier about the kind of goal of using social media as well, because in a similar way, you know, my Twitter is very much my professional academic perspective. My Facebook is, like you say, family members and the like. They serve two very different roles. You know, the information I put on them, you know, obviously very different. So excellent. Okay, there's a couple of questions that have come in. One from Daniel, which is saying about, we got a long one. Question about, ask you for thoughts on the militarization of cyberspace in terms of targeted information activity and outreach. and specifically any of your insights into the ethics of censorship, information warfare, and social influence. I'll leave it there.
Oh yeah, I'll just read the rest of it. Thank you. That's a really good question, and I don't think I've got a very good answer to that, actually. I think that's quite specific, probably a little bit outside my expertise, actually. I wouldn't want to kind of give much on that because I don't know enough about it, but it's a really good question. So much so that I can't answer it. That's how good a question it is. So yeah, I don't know if anybody else, other people may have answers to that one. Might have to field that one back, actually.
I don't have an answer to give straight away, but I mean it brings me on to a point I was quite interested to ask. One of the things I've always been very interested in, my former research used to be around insider threat detection and the use of online materials to understand, is someone posing a threat and how their behavior might change. So, the whole behavioral change angle there. So I guess there's kind of two sides to it. There's because there was an article a couple of weeks back saying about with work from home, employers are now going to monitor what you're doing in your work in your home to be able to make sure are you staying, So there's the questions there around invasion of the home life, and I suppose that really touches then on this, as well as this online and offline experience. There has become this whole work life and home life balance as well. And so how do we, if we accept that technology is, part and parcel of everything we do in life, you can't separate the two. How do we deal with these issues, and how do we, I suppose, bringing it back to kind of cybersecurity aspect, where's the standpoint about observing behaviors and all that kind of thing?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I mean, the kind of presenteeism and surveillance thing is obviously a big issue. I've seen quite a lot of stuff on that recently. I think the problem is that we're making use of these kind of very small behaviours, these sort of analytics as a way of understanding engagement, which is only one part of the story. I'm actually doing a presentation next week about technology use in sort of higher education. And it's talking about this idea of the way that, this year, particularly in education, we've been using our measure of engagement often has been based on these behavioural analytics, which just look at behavioural engagement. They look at, have people attended a Teams meeting, or, have they, contributed to done their task on Blackboard, or, when did they last access Blackboard? That only tells you one part of something broader about emotional, cognitive engagement. So if you apply that to things like the work context, this is where the kind of using these behavioural analytics becomes really problematic, because it's not telling you something broader about somebody's level of commitment to an organisation, their work pattern, and it becomes really quite invasive in that way. So I think making use of these analytics is problematic, and we have been relying on them, in which, it doesn't tell you everything about how productive somebody can be. And again, it's focusing on the time and these metrics that actually aren't always that useful for understanding things about people's commitments and things. So, yes, that probably diverted off a little bit from the question that you asked about. They don't tell us full story, do they?
Excellent. No, I mean, my take is context is critical. As you say, you've got these little bits which you can analyze, but without the context of the wider picture, you haven't really got that much to go off of. But no, excellent. I'm conscious we've just gone over the 1 hour mark, so we will wrap up there. Linda, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Really interesting debate to hear about cyber psychology. And, as we've said, it is very much a part of our lives. You can't separate the two. So, there's going to be a lot more interesting work here, and hopefully something that we can look to explore. And again, students, if you're interested in exploring cyber psychology topics, speak with Linda. I'm sure she'd be happy to hear from you. It's a really important area to be considering. So with that said, thank you ever so much again, Linda. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks very much. Nice to see you all. Thank you. Bye.
Yeah.
Bye for now. Cheers.
Bye.